It was a warm Tuesday afternoon when 15-year-old Marcus Williams took his usual shortcut through Oakwood Park. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky with strokes of orange and purple. Marcus had just finished basketball practice at Lincoln High School, and he was eager to get home for dinner. His mother had promised to make his favorite meal, fried chicken with mashed potatoes. Marcus walked along the concrete path, his basketball tucked under one arm and his gym bag hanging from his shoulder. The weight of the bag made him walk with a slight tilt, but he didn't mind. He was tall for his age, with kind brown eyes and a gentle smile that made people feel at ease around him. His friends often teased him for being too nice, but Marcus never saw kindness as a weakness. The park was mostly empty at this hour. A few joggers ran past him, and an old man walked his small dog near the pond. Marcus nodded politely to those he passed, just as his grandmother had taught him to do. Always acknowledge others, she would say. It costs nothing to be polite. As Marcus approached the eastern exit of the park, something caught his attention. On a wooden bench near the flower garden sat an elderly woman. What made Marcus pause was not her presence, rather the look of distress on her face. She was hunched over, clutching her leg, her face twisted in pain. Marcus slowed his pace, watching as other people walked past the woman without stopping. Some glanced her way but continued walking. Others seemed not to notice her at all. The woman tried to wave at a couple passing by, but they were busy talking and didn't see her. Marcus felt a tug in his chest. His mother had raised him to help those in need. "We all need somebody sometimes," she would tell him. Without giving it a second thought, Marcus changed direction and walked toward the bench. As he got closer, he could see that the elderly woman was in her late 70s, with silver hair pulled back into a neat bun. She wore a light blue dress with a cardigan despite the warm weather. Her face was lined with wrinkles, but Marcus thought she had kind eyes, even though they were now filled with tears. "Excuse me, ma'am," Marcus said softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you okay? Can I help you with something?" The woman looked up, surprised to see someone stopping. She hesitated for a moment, studying his face as if trying to decide whether to trust him. "Oh dear," she finally said, her voice shaky. "I've had a bit of an accident. I tripped over that uneven part of the sidewalk." She pointed to a spot where tree roots had pushed up the concrete. "I think I cut my leg rather badly." Marcus set down his basketball and gym bag and knelt to look. There was indeed a deep cut on her leg, and blood was soaking through her thin stocking. "My name is Marcus," he said gently. "What's your name?" "Eleanor Patterson," she replied. "Mrs. Eleanor Patterson. I live 6 blocks from here on Maple Street." "That's a nasty cut, Mrs. Patterson," Marcus said with concern. "Have you called anyone for help?" Mrs. Patterson shook her head sadly. "My phone is at home. I just went out for a short walk to get some fresh air. I didn't think I'd need it." A tear rolled down her cheek. "And my husband passed away 3 years ago. I live alone now." Marcus felt his heart sink at her words. He looked around, hoping to see someone else who might help, but the park had grown quieter as evening approached. He realized that if Mrs. Patterson was going to get help, it would have to come from him. Marcus looked at Mrs. Patterson's injured leg again. The cut was about 3 inches long, just below her knee. Blood had soaked through her stocking and was beginning to drip onto her shoe. He knew she needed medical help, but first, they had to stop the bleeding. "Mrs. Patterson, I think we need to put pressure on that cut," Marcus said calmly, though his heart was racing. He had learned basic first aid in health class last year, and his teacher's words came back to him. Direct pressure is the first step to control bleeding. "Do you have a handkerchief or napkin we could use?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her voice trembling slightly. Marcus shook his head. "No, ma'am, I don't. Let me check my gym bag." He quickly unzipped his bag and rummaged through it, pulling out shirts, shorts, and towels. Everything was sweaty from basketball practice. His clean clothes were in his locker at school. Marcus frowned, knowing these sweaty items wouldn't be good for an open wound. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Patterson. I don't have anything clean we can use," he said. The elderly woman's face fell. She pressed her hand against the cut, but blood seeped between her fingers. "Perhaps we should wait for someone else to come by," she suggested, though the park was growing emptier by the minute. Marcus looked around again. The joggers were gone. The man with the dog had left. The sun was sinking lower, and soon it would be dark. He couldn't leave Mrs. Patterson alone, and he couldn't let her wound go untreated. Then Marcus looked down at the shirt he was wearing. It was his favorite basketball shirt, bright blue with his school's logo on the front. His grandfather had given it to him last Christmas, just 3 months before he passed away. It was one of the few things Marcus had to remember him by. Without hesitation, Marcus grabbed the bottom of his shirt with both hands. "What are you doing, young man?" Mrs. Patterson asked, her eyes wide with surprise. "Making a bandage," Marcus replied simply. With a firm tug, he tore a large strip from the bottom of his shirt. The sound of ripping fabric seemed loud in the quiet park. He tore again, creating a long, wide strip of clean cotton. Mrs. Patterson gasped, "Oh, no, your nice shirt." Marcus just smiled. "It's okay, it's just a shirt. Your leg is more important." He folded the fabric to make it thicker, then knelt in front of Mrs. Patterson. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward her injured leg. Mrs. Patterson nodded, touched by the young man's kindness. Marcus carefully lifted her leg and placed it on his knee to get a better look at the wound. He noticed that there was some dirt in the cut from when she fell. He remembered another lesson from health class. Clean the wound before bandaging if possible. "I have some water in my bottle," Marcus said, reaching for his water bottle in the side pocket of his gym bag. "We should clean the cut first." Marcus poured a little water over the wound, using his fingers to gently wash away the dirt and dry blood. Mrs. Patterson winced, but did not complain. "I'm sorry if it hurts," Marcus said softly. "You're very gentle," Mrs. Patterson replied. "Are you planning to be a doctor?" Marcus smiled. "Maybe. I like science, and I like helping people." "You'd make a fine doctor," she said, watching as he carefully tended to her wound. After cleaning the cut as best he could, Marcus took the strip of fabric from his shirt and wrapped it firmly around Mrs. Patterson's leg. He tied it with enough pressure to slow the bleeding, but not so tight that it would cut off circulation. "How does that feel?" he asked when he finished. Mrs. Patterson moved her leg slightly. "Much better, thank you. You're very skilled for someone so young." Marcus stood up and looked at his handiwork. The blue fabric was already turning dark with blood and spots, but the bleeding seemed to be slowing down. "We still need to get you home and maybe to a doctor," Marcus said, looking at Mrs. Patterson's pale face. He worried that she might be going into shock. "Do you think you can walk if I help you?" Mrs. Patterson looked uncertain. "I'm not sure, dear. My leg hurts quite a bit, and I feel a little dizzy." Marcus thought for a moment. "It's getting dark. We need to get you home. I could go for help, but I don't want to leave you alone." He looked at his phone, hoping to call for help, but the screen showed a dead battery. Basketball practice had run long, and he'd been using his phone to play music in the locker room. "My phone is dead," he said with disappointment. Then he made a decision. "I'll help you walk home. We'll take it slow, and you can lean on me." Marcus carefully helped Mrs. Patterson to her feet. She wobbled slightly, and he quickly put his arm around her waist to steady her. Despite being only 15, Marcus was strong from years of basketball practice. Mrs. Patterson felt light against his side, almost fragile. "Put your arm around my shoulder," Marcus instructed gently, "and we'll take one step at a time." Mrs. Patterson did as he suggested, gripping his shoulder with surprising strength. Her other hand held a small purse that hung from her wrist. "I'm sorry to be such a bother," she said, her voice thin with pain. "You're not a bother at all," Marcus replied. "My mom always says that helping others is what makes us human." They took their first steps together, slowly leaving the park bench behind. Mrs. Patterson winced with each movement, but she didn't complain. Marcus adjusted his pace to match hers, patient despite knowing his mother would be worried about him being late. 6 blocks to Maple Street, right?" Marcus asked, trying to distract Mrs. Patterson from her pain. "Yes, the blue house with white shutters," she answered. "Number 1842. As they walked, the streetlights began to flicker on. The evening grew cooler, and Marcus noticed Mrs. Patterson shiver slightly. He wished he had a jacket to offer her. The torn shirt he wore provided little warmth now. "Are you cold?" he asked with concern. "A little," she admitted. "But we'll be home soon." They passed the corner store where Marcus often bought candy after school. Mr. Chen, the owner, was just locking up. He looked up, surprised to see Marcus helping an elderly woman. Everything okay? Mr. Chen called out. Mrs. Patterson had a fall in the park, Marcus explained. I'm helping her get home. Mr. Chen hurried over. Do you need me to call someone? An ambulance, perhaps? Mrs. Patterson shook her head. No, thank you. This young man has been very kind. I just need to get home. My neighbor is a nurse. I'll ask her to look at my leg when I get there. Mr. Chen nodded, then looked at Marcus with newfound respect. You need anything, you let me know, he said, before returning to his store. They continued their slow journey. By the third block, Marcus could feel Mrs. Patterson leaning more heavily on him. Her breathing had become shallow, and beads of sweat formed on her forehead despite the cool evening air. Let's rest a minute, Marcus suggested, gesturing to a low wall in front of someone's garden. Mrs. Patterson sank down gratefully. Thank you, she whispered. Her face had grown paler, and Marcus worried about the blood she had lost. He checked the makeshift bandage on her leg. The blue fabric was now mostly dark with blood, but it didn't seem to be soaking through completely. The bleeding had slowed, which was a good sign. How are you feeling? Marcus asked, kneeling in front of her. A bit dizzy, Mrs. Patterson admitted. And my leg throbs something terrible. Marcus nodded sympathetically. We're halfway there. Just 3 more blocks. As they sat there catching their breath, a car slowed down beside them. The window rolled down, and a middle-aged woman peered out. Is everything all right? She asked, her voice filled with concern. My friend had a fall in the park, Marcus explained. I'm helping her get home to Maple Street. The woman looked at Mrs. Patterson's bandaged leg and Marcus's torn shirt. Understanding dawned on her face. Would you like a ride? I'm heading that way. Relief washed over Marcus. That would be wonderful, thank you. The woman got out and helped Marcus ease Mrs. Patterson into the passenger seat. Marcus climbed into the back, carefully placing his basketball and gym bag on the floor. I'm Janet, the woman said as she started driving. I live on Elm Street, just past Maple. I'm Marcus, and this is Mrs. Patterson, Marcus replied. Mrs. Patterson turned slightly in her seat. This young man tore his own shirt to bandage my leg, she told Janet. I'd never seen such kindness from a stranger, especially one so young. Janet smiled at Marcus in the rearview mirror. That was very thoughtful of you. Marcus looked down, slightly embarrassed by the praise. Anyone would have done the same, he mumbled. No, Mrs. Patterson said firmly. Not anyone. Many people walked right past me in the park. You were the only one who stopped. The car turned onto Maple Street, and Mrs. Patterson pointed out her blue house with white shutters. As Janet pulled into the driveway, Marcus noticed lights were on inside. Perhaps the nurse neighbor was already there. Janet turned off the engine. Let me help you both inside, she offered. Marcus nodded gratefully. This unexpected journey was about to enter a new phase, and he wondered what would happen next. The blue house with white shutters looked warm and inviting from the outside. Flower boxes hung from the windows, filled with colorful petunias and marigolds. A stone path led from the driveway to the front door, lined with small solar lights that glowed softly in the growing darkness. Janet helped Mrs. Patterson out of the car while Marcus grabbed his things from the back seat. Together, they slowly made their way to the front door. Mrs. Patterson fumbled in her purse for her keys, her hands shaking slightly. Here, let me help, Marcus offered, taking the keys gently from her trembling fingers. He found the right key and opened the door. The inside of Mrs. Patterson's home was neat and tidy, but clearly the home of someone who had lived a full life. Photos covered the walls, black and white images of young couples from decades past, color photos of children growing up, and more recent pictures of smiling grandchildren. A grandfather clock ticked steadily in the corner of the living room, and the furniture, though old, was well cared for. The sofa, please, Mrs. Patterson said weakly, pointing to a floral-patterned couch in the living room. Marcus and Janet carefully helped her sit down. Mrs. Patterson sighed with relief as she finally took weight off her injured leg. Janet helped her elevate the leg by placing a cushion under it. I should call your neighbor, the nurse, Marcus said, remembering what Mrs. Patterson had mentioned earlier. What's her name and number? Her name is Rose Wilson, Mrs. Patterson replied. Her number is by the telephone in the kitchen, the black book next to the phone. Marcus found the kitchen easily. It was small but cozy, with yellow curtains and plants on the windowsill. The phone hung on the wall, and beside it was a small black address book. He flipped through it until he found Wilson, Rose, and dialed the number. A warm voice answered on the third ring. Hello? Hello, Ms. Wilson. My name is Marcus. I'm calling from Mrs. Patterson's house. She had a fall in the park and cut her leg. She said you're a nurse and might be able to help. Eleanor fell. I'll be right over. Don't move her, Rose said, concern evident in her voice. I'm just 2 houses down. Thank you, Marcus replied, relieved that help was coming. When he returned to the living room, Janet was helping Mrs. Patterson remove her blood-soaked stocking. The makeshift bandage from Marcus's shirt was still in place. Rose is coming, Marcus announced. She said she'll be here in a minute. Thank you, dear, Mrs. Patterson said. She looked at Marcus properly for the first time since they'd entered her home. Her eyes widened when she saw his torn shirt. Oh, look what happened to your nice shirt, and it has your school logo on it too. Marcus looked down. The bottom of his shirt was jagged where he had torn it. The Lincoln High Leopards logo was still visible on the chest, but the shirt was ruined. He shrugged. It's just a shirt. But wasn't it special? Mrs. Patterson asked. You hesitated just a moment before you tore it. I noticed. Marcus was surprised that she had picked up on that small detail despite her pain. My grandfather gave it to me last Christmas. He died 3 months later. But he would have wanted me to help you. He was always helping people too. Mrs. Patterson's eyes filled with tears. What was your grandfather's name? James Williams, Marcus answered. Everyone called him Big Jim. A look of surprise crossed Mrs. Patterson's face. Big Jim Williams? From the East Side? Worked at the auto plant for 40 years. Marcus nodded, confused. Yes, that's him. Did you know my grandfather? Before Mrs. Patterson could answer, there was a knock at the door. Janet went to answer it and returned with Rose Wilson, a sturdy woman in her 50s carrying a large medical bag. Eleanor, what happened? Rose asked, immediately moving to examine the injured leg. While Rose carefully removed the makeshift bandage and began cleaning the wound properly, Janet touched Marcus's shoulder. It's getting late, she said softly. Do you need a ride home? Your parents must be worried. Marcus glanced at the clock on the wall. It was almost 7:30 p.m. His mother would definitely be worried by now. Yes, thank you, he said. But he looked over at Mrs. Patterson, reluctant to leave without making sure she would be okay. Mrs. Patterson caught his eye and smiled. Go on home, dear. Rose will take good care of me, but please come back tomorrow if you can. I think we have a lot to talk about. Marcus nodded. I will. I promise. The next day after school, Marcus stood on Mrs. Patterson's front porch, holding a small bouquet of yellow daisies he had bought with his allowance money. He had called his mother from Janet's car the night before, explaining everything that had happened. Instead of being upset about his lateness or his ruined shirt, she had hugged him tightly when he got home. I'm proud of you, she had said. Your grandfather would be proud too. Now, Marcus rang the doorbell and waited nervously. He wasn't sure why Mrs. Patterson had reacted the way she did when he mentioned his grandfather's name. Did she really know Big Jim Williams? And if so, how? The door opened, and Rose Wilson greeted him with a warm smile. You must be Marcus, she said. Eleanor told me all about what you did. Come in, she's been waiting for you. Marcus followed Rose into the living room. Mrs. Patterson was sitting in an armchair, her injured leg propped up on a footstool. She looked much better than she had the day before. The color had returned to her cheeks, and she was wearing a fresh blue dress similar to the one from yesterday. Marcus, she exclaimed when she saw him. You came back. I promised I would, he replied, handing her the flowers. These are for you. How's your leg? Mrs. Patterson accepted the daisies with a delighted smile. 12 stitches, she said, patting her bandaged leg. But Rose says it will heal nicely. No infection, thanks to your quick thinking. Rose nodded in agreement. That makeshift bandage probably prevented a lot of dirt from getting in the wound. Smart boy, she took the flowers from Mrs. Patterson. I'll put these in water for you, Eleanor. As Rose left for the kitchen, Mrs. Patterson gestured to the sofa. Please sit down. Would you like some cookies? Rose baked them this morning. Marcus sat down, eyeing the plate of chocolate chip cookies on the coffee table. Yes, please, he said, taking one. Mrs. Patterson, yesterday you seemed surprised when I mentioned my grandfather. Did you know him? Mrs. Patterson's eyes grew misty. Yes, I knew Big Jim Williams. Everyone in the East Side knew him. She reached for a photo album that was sitting on the side table and opened it. Look here. She pointed to a black and white photograph. A much younger Mrs. Patterson stood next to a tall, broad-shouldered black man that Marcus immediately recognized as his grandfather. They were standing in front of an old building with a sign that read East Side Community Center. Your grandfather saved my life, Mrs. Patterson said quietly. Marcus nearly choked on his cookie. He what? Mrs. Patterson nodded. It was 1962. I was a young teacher at Lincoln Elementary. One winter day, my car slid off the road during a snowstorm and crashed into a ditch. The car was filling with snow, and I couldn't get out. Your grandfather was driving by and stopped to help. He pulled me out just before another car lost control and hit mine. Marcus stared at the photograph, then at Mrs. Patterson. He never told me that story. That was Jim, Mrs. Patterson said with a fond smile. He never bragged about the good things he did. After that, we both volunteered at the community center. He taught boxing to the boys, and I tutored children after school. We worked together for many years. Marcus ran his finger over his grandfather's image. I miss him a lot. I know, Mrs. Patterson said gently. I lost touch with him after I moved to this side of town. My husband got a job here, and we relocated. I had no idea his grandson would be the one to help me all these years later. Her voice broke slightly. It's like life has come full circle. Rose returned with the daisies in a vase and set them on the coffee table. Eleanor showed you the photo, I see, she said to Marcus. Marcus nodded, still processing this unexpected connection. It's strange how things work out. Your grandfather believed in something he called the circle of kindness. Mrs. Patterson explained. He said that when you do something kind, it eventually comes back to you or to someone you love. I never expected to see the proof of that with my own eyes. Marcus thought about this. The shirt his grandfather had given him had been used to help someone whose life his grandfather had saved. It was almost too much to take in. Would you like to see more photos? Mrs. Patterson asked, turning the page of the album. I have many from those days at the community center. Yes, Marcus said eagerly. I'd like that very much. For the next hour, Marcus and Mrs. Patterson looked through old photographs. Each picture told a story about his grandfather that Marcus had never heard before. There was Big Jim organizing a food drive during a tough winter. Another showed him fixing the roof of a widow's house. In each photo, his grandfather wore the same expression, not seeking praise, just quietly doing what needed to be done. He never talked much about these things, Marcus said, carefully turning the pages of the photo album. Mom says he believed that good deeds should be done quietly. Mrs. Patterson nodded. That was Jim. He used to say, if you're doing something kind to be seen doing it, then you're doing it for the wrong reason. That sounded exactly like the grandfather Marcus remembered. He felt a warm glow inside, knowing that his spontaneous act of kindness had somehow connected him to his grandfather's legacy. Would you like some tea? Mrs. Patterson asked, attempting to stand up. Please, let me, Marcus said quickly, gently pressing her shoulder to keep her seated. Just tell me where everything is. Mrs. Patterson smiled gratefully. The tea is in the cabinet above the stove. Cups are in the cabinet to the right. Thank you, dear. Rose had left earlier, satisfied that Mrs. Patterson was in good hands. Marcus found his way around the kitchen easily. While waiting for the water to boil, he noticed more photographs on the refrigerator door. Most were of children and teenagers who must be Mrs. Patterson's grandchildren. When the tea was ready, Marcus carefully carried 2 cups back to the living room. He handed one to Mrs. Patterson and sat down with his own. You mentioned you have grandchildren? Marcus asked, gesturing toward the kitchen. A shadow crossed Mrs. Patterson's face. Yes, 3. They live in California with my daughter. I haven't seen them in person for almost 2 years. That must be hard, Marcus said sympathetically. Mrs. Patterson sipped her tea before answering. It is. My daughter is very busy with her career. They visit when they can, but, she trailed off, her eyes distant. Marcus understood the unspoken words. Mrs. Patterson was lonely. He thought about how she had been sitting alone in the park when she fell. How many people had walked past without stopping to help? How she lived alone in this house filled with memories. "Do you have any family nearby?" he asked gently. Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "No, dear. My husband passed 3 years ago. My sister lives in Florida. Most of my friends have either moved away to be near their children or—" She didn't finish the sentence, but Marcus understood this too. At her age, friends were lost to more than just distance. Outside, the afternoon light was beginning to fade. Marcus knew he should be heading home soon for dinner, but he was reluctant to leave Mrs. Patterson alone. "Would it be okay if I came to visit you sometimes?" he asked suddenly. "I could help with things around the house, or just keep you company." Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened in surprise. Then, to Marcus's alarm, they filled with tears. For a moment, he thought he had said something wrong. "I'm sorry," he began, but Mrs. Patterson shook her head. "No, no," she said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. "You haven't upset me. It's just your kindness. First you tear your special shirt to help a stranger, and now you offer your time." Her voice trembled. "Do you know how rare that is nowadays?" Marcus wasn't sure how to respond, so he simply said, "My mom always says time is the most valuable thing you can give someone." Mrs. Patterson nodded, composing herself. "Your mother is a wise woman. I would love it if you visited now and then." She hesitated, then added, "But I don't want to take up too much of your time. A young man like you must have many activities and friends." Marcus thought about his afternoons after basketball practice. Usually, he just went home, did homework, and played video games. "I have time," he assured her. "And I want to hear more stories about my grandfather." Mrs. Patterson's face brightened. "I have so many to share." She reached out and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Marcus. Not just for the bandage, but for bringing light back into this old house." On his walk home that evening, Marcus felt lighter somehow, as if he had found something he hadn't realized he was missing. Over the next few weeks, Marcus fell into a new routine. 3 days a week after basketball practice, he would stop by Mrs. Patterson's house. Sometimes he stayed for just half an hour, other times for a couple of hours. His mother, after meeting Mrs. Patterson, fully supported this new friendship. "You're doing something important," she told Marcus one evening. "Connecting generations is powerful magic." On this particular Wednesday afternoon, Marcus was helping Mrs. Patterson in her garden. Her leg had healed well enough that she could move around the house, but bending and kneeling were still difficult. Marcus dug holes for new flowers while Mrs. Patterson, seated in a lawn chair, directed him. "A little deeper for the roses," she instructed. "They need room for their roots to spread." Marcus wiped sweat from his forehead and dug deeper. The spring sun was warm on his back, and the soil smelled rich and earthy. He enjoyed this work more than he had expected to. There was something satisfying about preparing the earth for new life. "Mrs. P," he said, using the nickname he had given her, "did my grandfather like gardening too?" Mrs. Patterson laughed. "Goodness, no. Jim had many talents, but gardening wasn't one of them. He once tried to help me plant tomatoes at the community center garden. Planted them upside down, roots sticking up in the air." Marcus grinned, picturing his tall, strong grandfather confused by something as simple as a tomato plant. "I didn't know that about him." "There's a lot you probably don't know," Mrs. Patterson said gently. "That's why stories are important. They keep people alive in our hearts." As they worked, Mrs. Patterson told more stories about Big Jim Williams. How he organized a basketball tournament for kids who couldn't afford to join the school team. How he fixed cars for single mothers and refused payment. How he stood up against discrimination at the auto plant, risking his own job to ensure fair treatment for others. "Your grandfather believed in justice," Mrs. Patterson explained. "But he also believed in kindness. He said justice without kindness becomes cold, and kindness without justice becomes weak." Marcus thought about this as he planted a rose bush. These were the kinds of lessons he wished his grandfather had lived long enough to teach him directly. Around 4 o'clock, Janet, the woman who had driven them home that first night, walked by with her dog. She stopped at the garden fence. "Well, look at you two," she said cheerfully. "How's the leg, Eleanor?" "Much better, thanks to this young man and Rose," Mrs. Patterson replied. "Marcus, you remember Janet, don't you?" Marcus nodded and waved. Thanks again for the ride that night. Janet smiled. I'm glad I happened to be driving by. Actually, I've been meaning to tell you both something. I was so moved by what I saw that night, a young man helping an elderly woman, tearing his own shirt to make a bandage, that I wrote a letter about it to our local newspaper. Marcus froze, a trowel in his hand. You wrote about us? Janet nodded. Just a short letter to the editor about kindness in our community. I didn't use your full names, just first names and what happened. It was published yesterday. She reached into her purse and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. I brought you a copy. Mrs. Patterson took the clipping and read it aloud. A reminder of human kindness. Last week, I witnessed something that restored my faith in humanity. A young man named Marcus tore his own shirt to bandage an elderly woman's wound and helped her get home safely. In a world often focused on division, this simple act of compassion between a black teenager and a white senior citizen reminded me that kindness crosses all boundaries. Janet Miller. When she finished reading, Mrs. Patterson's eyes were wet with tears again. It's beautiful, Janet. Thank you. Marcus felt his cheeks grow warm. He hadn't done anything special, just what anyone should do. But looking at Mrs. Patterson's face, he realized his simple act had meant more than he understood. The paper called me this morning, Janet continued. They want to do a full story. They're interested in interviewing both of you. Something about building community bridges. Would you be willing? Marcus looked at Mrs. Patterson uncertainly. He hadn't helped her for attention. In fact, the idea of being in the newspaper made him uncomfortable. What would his grandfather think about that? Mrs. Patterson noticed Marcus's discomfort and gently patted his hand. Why don't we think about it, Janet? It's a big decision. Janet nodded understandingly. Of course. Take your time. The reporter said there's no rush. She waved goodbye and continued her walk with her dog. After Janet left, Marcus and Mrs. Patterson sat quietly for a moment. The garden was peaceful, with birds chirping in the nearby trees and a light breeze rustling the leaves. You don't want to do the interview, do you? Mrs. Patterson asked softly. Marcus shrugged, planting the last flower before sitting on the grass beside Mrs. Patterson's chair. I'm not sure. It feels strange. I didn't help you to get attention or be in the newspaper. Mrs. Patterson smiled, just like her grandfather. He never wanted recognition either. She looked thoughtfully at the newspaper clipping in her hand. But sometimes, Marcus, sharing stories of kindness isn't about getting attention. It's about inspiring others. Marcus considered this. What do you mean? Well, Mrs. Patterson began. Think about how many people walked past me that day in the park. Maybe they were busy. Maybe they were afraid to get involved. But what if they had read a story like this one? What if they had been reminded that helping others matters? Maybe next time they would stop. The idea made sense to Marcus. He thought about how his grandfather's stories had inspired him, even though he'd heard them secondhand. I have an idea, Mrs. Patterson said suddenly. She reached into her pocket and pulled out something wrapped in tissue paper. I've been saving this for the right moment. She carefully unwrapped the paper to reveal the torn piece of Marcus's shirt, clean now but still stained with faint traces of blood. Rose washed it for me. I wanted to keep it as a reminder of your kindness. Marcus stared at the blue fabric with his school logo. You kept it? Mrs. Patterson nodded. What if we agree to the interview? We show them this? We could tell them about your grandfather, too, about his belief in the circle of kindness. How he saved me years ago, and then his shirt, his gift to you, helped save me again. Marcus felt something shift inside him. Told that way, it wasn't about seeking attention. It was about honoring his grandfather's legacy and perhaps inspiring others to be kind. I think Grandpa would like that, he said finally. The next week, a reporter and photographer from the city newspaper came to Mrs. Patterson's house. They sat in the same living room where Marcus had first seen the photos of his grandfather. Mrs. Patterson wore her blue dress, and Marcus wore his basketball uniform, having come directly from practice. They told their story. How Marcus had found Mrs. Patterson injured in the park, how he had torn his special shirt to make a bandage, and how they later discovered the connection to Marcus's grandfather. Mrs. Patterson showed them the torn piece of shirt and the old photographs of Big Jim Williams. It's like the universe has a long memory, she told the reporter, her eyes bright with emotion. Jim saved me 60 years ago, and then his grandson saved me again, using a gift from his grandfather to do it. The story was published the following Sunday with the headline, The Circle of Kindness, How a Grandfather's Legacy Saved the Same Woman Twice. The photo showed Marcus and Mrs. Patterson sitting together on her porch, holding the torn shirt between them, both smiling. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The newspaper received dozens of letters from readers moved by the story. The principal at Lincoln High School read the article during morning announcements. Marcus's basketball teammates, who had once teased him for being too nice, now looked at him with new respect. But the most meaningful response came from Mrs. Patterson's daughter in California. She called the day after the article was published. "Mom," she said, tears in her voice, "we're coming home for the summer. All of us. I had no idea you were so alone there. Why didn't you tell me?" 1 month later,